everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. We are going to look at probably the best passage in the New Testament in support of the Protestant canon, and that is Luke 11:49 through 51, and it's parallel in Matthew 23, 34 through 36. Now, last week we looked at the possible threefold division in Luke. Well, this week I think is going to be the argument. In fact, I think this is the strongest of all the Protestant arguments against the so-called Apocrypha or Deuterocanon. I call it the Bookends argument because basically the argument holds that Jesus made bookends to the Bible, a beginning and an end, and based on that, they're able to rule out the possibility of the Deuterocanon, or supposedly so. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to break that down today. And I think it's been propounded in many different sources. Probably the most prestigious source is Roger Beckwith's The Old Testament Canon, New Testament Church. And this is how Beckwith phrases the argument. He says, quote, that's Jesus's utterance about all the righteous blood from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, which is found in Matthew 23:35 and Luke 11:51, in all probability implies that for Jesus and his hearers, the canon began with Genesis and ended with Chronicles. Seeing that the murder of Abel is recorded near the beginning of the former book, Genesis 4:3 through 15, and the murder of Zechariah near the end of the latter book, 2 Chronicles 24:19 through 22, this appears to reflect the traditional Jewish arrangements of the books. Then he continues, whereby Chronicles is not placed with Samuel and Kings in the second group of books, but is put in the third and last group as its concluding item, unquote. So that's basically it, that they take Jesus's words and they try to make it into bookends for the canon. And if you want to break this down into its premises, this is how it runs. It runs that Luke 11:51, Matthew 23:35 speaks of the shed righteous blood of all the prophets from Abel in Genesis to Zechariah in 2 Chronicles. And by the way, I think we're going to be focusing mainly on that identification of Zechariah in 2 Chronicles. The second premise is that Chronicles is the last book of the Hebrew/Protestant Old Testament Bible. So Jesus says all the blood of the prophets from Abel to Zechariah. Zechariah identifies 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles is the last book in the Hebrew Bible. Therefore, Jesus affirms the bookends of Scripture by affirming Genesis all the way through 2 Chronicles. And then one could say, well, that means that anything written after 2 Chronicles is not inspired Scripture. And that's how the argument runs, folks. So there are a lot of problems with this argument, even though I think it's the best argument. It really is, in some ways, not that great. Okay? So we're going to break it down into the basic premises, whether they hold true, some unspoken assumptions, and we'll see whether this really is a good argument. But before we do that, it's important to refresh our memories about what exactly Jesus says in these texts. So Luke 11:49 through 51 reads, therefore the wisdom of God said, I will send to them prophets and apostles. Some of them they will kill and persecute, in order that this generation might be charged with the blood of all the prophets shed from the foundation of the world, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who died between the altar and the temple building. Yes, I tell you, this generation will be charged with their blood, unquote. So important identifying markers here is that he's identifying prophets. So Abel and Zechariah are identified as prophets, that their blood was shed, and that specifically Zechariah's blood was shed between the altar and the temple building. Now, in his parallel verse, Matthew 23, Matthew provides a few more important details. It reads in verse 34, quote, therefore, behold, I send to you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and pursue from town to town, so that there will come upon you all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the righteous blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. So, in addition to Luke, that he identifies Zechariah as a prophet, as being slain in the temple area between the sanctuary and the altar, here it says, we also learn a patronym. In other words, who his father is. He is the son of Berechiah. And the final identifying marker is whom you murdered, which, if you take it in its plain natural sense, means you, the audience, murdered. So that might point to a contemporary. So the bookends of argument in premise one identifies Zechariah as the Zechariah who dies in Second Chronicles. In fact, if that's not the Zechariah, bookends argument kind of falls apart. So how certain is this lock between Jesus' Zechariah and the Zechariah Second Chronicles? Well, actually, it's a lot looser than you might think, because there are several possible candidates for the job. Some are more likely than others. For example, Zechariah the son of Baruch is mentioned in Josephus, Jewish Wars 454. He's murdered in the temple area. His name is Zechariah. He could be a prophet, but obviously the patronym's wrong, because we're looking for the son of Berechiah, not Baruch. Although someone could try to stretch Berechiah to mean Baruch, but quite frankly, that is a stretch. And then you have the problem of his martyrdom occurs long after the time of Christ, and that doesn't quite fit the bill because Jesus isn't giving a prophecy. Next candidate is Zechariah, son of Berechiah, which could be a shortened form of Jehoiada. And this is in, or a longer form, excuse me, of Jehoiada in Isaiah 8:2-4, but we're not given any details. So since it doesn't match the patronym, doesn't match any of the other things, we'll cross it off our list. Next candidate is Zechariah, son of Jehoiada in Second Chronicles. Now, this is the Zechariah that the bookends argument identifies as definitely the Zechariah Jesus is talking about. So we'll talk more about him. There's also another candidate, Zechariah the prophet, one of the 12 minor prophets. We'll learn about that, of course, in the book of Zechariah. And then there's a couple other candidates that normally aren't considered, but I think still have possibility. Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, mentioned in Luke 1. Also, there's the outside possibility that Jesus may be referring to a contemporary figure that otherwise we don't know about. And this, I think, is a live option. Jesus does occasionally refer to things that aren't found elsewhere in Scripture, and that includes people that aren't found elsewhere in Scripture. So this might be one of those instances. So as you see, we have lots of candidates. Most of them, I think, are live options. They're possibilities. So let's look at the best ones and see what kind of grounding they have, how strong of a case could be made for them. The first one is Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, the bookends argument, Zechariah. Now, this Zechariah is a prophet, and he was killed in the sanctuary area. Excuse me. But there's a problem, and that is the patronym. Jesus is Zechariah. In fact, let me bring that up. See, Jesus is Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, where in Second Chronicles, twice it identifies Zechariah's father as being Jehoiada, not Berechiah. And in fact, it does it twice in two different ways, both in the Greek and the Hebrew. It identifies him as the son of Jehoiada, and then he identifies Jehoiada as Zechariah's father. So it's pretty clear Zechariah here is the son of Jehoiada, not the son of Berechiah. Now, in order to make this work, people then say, well, Jesus might not be given the patronym of this Zechariah being his immediate father, but maybe his grandfather. And of course, the problem with that is it has no biblical support. In fact, the only reason you would suggest that is to make the bookends argument work, right? There's nothing in the text that suggests anything like that is going on. And it's definitely not the natural reading. So that's a couple of strikes against this Jehoiada. Well, what about the other candidates? We have Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, in Zechariah 1 and 7. This is the prophet Zechariah. In fact, he's twice identified as the son of Berechiah in verse 1 and verse 7 of the book of Zechariah. He was a prophet, and the problem is Scripture nowhere explains how he dies. So that's kind of a question mark, how he dies. So this is a little bit better fit than the son of Jehoiada in that the patronym actually sticks. He is a prophet, although it's silent on how he dies or where he dies. Although I do have to say there is a very weak Jewish tradition, and I'd underscore weak, that the prophet Zechariah, one of the 12 minor prophets, was indeed martyred in the temple area. And this can be found in an Aramaic paraphrase of the Book of Lamentations, known as a Targum. Targum on Lamentations 2:20 says, quote, "The attribute of justice answered and said, and thus said, it is fitting to murder in the house of the sanctuary the Lord, the priest, and the prophet, as you murdered Zechariah the son of Iddo, the high priest and the faithful prophet, in the house of the sanctuary of the Lord on the day of atonement, because he admonished you not to do that which is evil before the Lord," unquote. So we have this Targumic tradition that the prophet Zechariah was martyred in the temple area. This is a Jewish tradition and a bit weak, but at least there is some possibility that maybe that's who Jesus is talking about. So here's a chart. I kind of map out where which candidate is able to check off which box in terms of identifiers. All of them are prophets in these last four candidates. Only two have the proper, well, let me go through this. Jehoiada, of course, is a prophet, and he is murdered in the temple area, but the patronym does not match. So I should actually put an X there, not a blank. And whom you murdered would have to be taken in a historical sense, which is not natural to the passage, so I don't have a check mark there. Son of Berechiah, the prophet Zechariah, it is a prophet, and it does have the proper patronym, but Scripture is silent as to how he died, although there may have been a Jewish tradition that he died in the temple area. And whom you murdered, again, would have to be taken in a historical sense, which is not the natural reading. So I think it's slightly better than the son of Jehoiada. What about the father of John the Baptist? This is a really interesting possibility because the early church fathers had a legend that circulated that indeed John the Baptist's father, Zechariah, was martyred in the temple area. Now, there's two different streams of this legend, and which the details really aren't important. What matters is both streams point to his martyrdom in this location. So that, I think, could qualify as a possible match, that there's this memory within Christianity of his martyrdom. It would also, by the way, make Jesus's comment, "who you murdered," actually taken in their plain, regular sense, that Jesus's audience was complicit in Zechariah's martyrdom. And Scripture is silent on the patronym. We don't know who John the Baptist's father is. At least I'm not familiar with it, so we'll leave that blank. Now, the last possibility is kind of a catch-all possibility, and that is that maybe Jesus as Zechariah is an individual who lived during the time of Jesus, was martyred in the temple area. His audience was complicit in his martyrdom. He was the son of Berechiah, and he was a prophet. So he'd check off all boxes. Of course, the big problem with the unknown contemporary is that he's unknown, right? Scripture doesn't attest to the existence of this individual. And like I mentioned before, this shouldn't be too big of a negative because the Gospels do reference things that are unique and aren't mentioned anywhere else in history. So um, it's possible Jesus could have been talking about contemporary. That would make the reading very natural, and it would make the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah refer to all the righteous blood shed upon earth from the very beginning to the very end, to that very day, I should say. And that would be a very nice, neat reading. So as you can see here, the identification of Jesus as Zechariah as the son of Jehoiada doesn't really match. It's a bit problematic, especially given the different patronym and the different twists and turns people have to do to make this fit. Okay, so much for the first premise. Now, actually, I have to also point out that there's an unspoken assumption in the bookends argument in the first premise, and that is the assumption that the martyrdom Jesus mentions would necessarily correspond to the last and first books of the Bible. Now, where in Scripture does it teach that Scripture will contain an account of the first martyrdom and the last martyrdom? It doesn't. It's just an assumption. And I think it's a rather dubious assumption. In fact, it's not just a martyrdom, it's a martyrdom of those who are slain by their own people. And you could even make it even more specific because it seems that Jesus is referring to especially martyrdoms from their own people whose blood cries out for vengeance. And that's something that the blood of Abel and the blood of Zechariah, son of Jehoiada, actually have in common. Okay. But there's no reason to expect that these two prophets would be chronologically, or at least canonically, the first and last book. In fact, it stands to reason that you could concede this whole point. You could concede the premise and say, fine, this martyrdom occurs in Genesis and this martyrdom occurs in Second Chronicles. But there could be later writings, later canonical writings, that simply don't record a martyrdom of this specificity, right? Because like Maccabees, there's plenty of Maccabean martyrs, but they were martyred by pagans, not their contemporaries, and their blood didn't cry out for vengeance. So there is kind of like an unspoken assumption that there's this correspondence of reporting martyrdoms with particular books. And that has to be established. And it really can't be established. There's nothing in Scripture to establish that, nor is it anything that I think would stand to reason, right? So the Catholic canon still could be the true canon, and the bookends argument pretty much stand untouched. So it fails to prove its point. What about the second premise that Second Chronicles, or the Book of Chronicles, because Second and First Chronicles were combined into one book? What about the claim that it was the last book of the Hebrew Bible? And according to Beckwith, that there was a Jewish tradition that this was the last book of the Bible. How well founded is this? And I think this is really where the bookends argument falls completely apart. It's already falling apart looking at the first premise, but it gets destroyed in the second premise. When we look at history and all the evidence, we find that there is really no solid reason to believe Chronicles was the last book in Jesus's Bible. There is one document, the Brita Bava Bafra 14b. It's a rabbinic book, rabbinic writing, written in the second Christian century, so it's post-Christian, in which it gives the list of the writings accepted by the rabbis. And notice here it ends with Chronicles. Okay. Now, the thing about this text is it's utterly singular in the ancient world. Now, don't just take my word for it. Let's look at the evidence. Okay. If you look at Christian list of scripture, what you'll find is that only one list ends the Old Testament with Chronicles. Now, here's a list of all Christian lists. The ones highlighted in yellow are those lists that specifically the authors trying to reproduce the rabbi's Bible. And as you can see here, the last books are usually amongst these: Ezra and Nehemiah, or Esther, or Daniel. You don't see Second Chronicles here, except for one list. And that is a list that's not trying to reproduce the Rabbinic Bible. That's Innocent the First list in 405, where you list as Chronicles. And the ordering of this list is pretty eccentric. So there's really no historical backing for it. So we don't see any evidence in Christianity, especially those fathers who had contact with the Jews and knew which books the Jews were using at the time, any evidence of Chronicles being last. What about manuscript evidence? Well, let's look at Hebrew manuscript evidence. Now, the first two names right here are important: Aleppo and Leningrad/St. Petersburg Codex. Now, these are codices. They're complete Hebrew Bibles, and they're the most ancient complete Hebrew Bibles. They're dated roughly around the turn of the first millennium. Okay. So about 300 or 400 years after the earliest complete Christian Greek Bibles. Now, what do these complete Hebrew Bibles say? They all have Ezra and Nehemiah as last in their books. So the great codices, the Tiberian codices, they all have Ezra and Nehemiah last, not Chronicles. In fact, I think Chronicles is first of the writings. When we look at the other manuscript evidence, we see that it's mixed, that there's several manuscripts that end with Chronicles. There's several that end with Ezra and Nehemiah. And in the middle, but these are Middle Ages. This is like after 1200s, we start seeing this mixture occurring. Finally, of course, you have the earliest printed editions of the Hebrew Bible. All of those uniformly have Chronicles at the end. So there's no evidence of Second Chronicles being the last book, except for Baba Batra, this one document in the second Christian century. And actually, Lee Martin MacDonald, a Protestant canonical scholar, argues that this Baba Batra didn't have very good reception within Rabbinic Judaism. And so its influence isn't that great. And as we can see, it certainly didn't influence the order, right? Now, you would expect that if the bookend argument is so apparent and obvious, that early church fathers and the Protestant reformers, they'd all see this, especially the Protestant reformers, because this would vindicate the Protestant Bible. But the strange thing is, no one makes the bookends argument until around 1780 with Johann Eichhorn. Now, there's a fantastic article written by Edmund Gallagher. It's titled The Blood of Zechariah. It's in New Testament Studies, 2014. Check it out if you can get a hold of it. He does an excellent job tracing the history of interpretation of these passages. And he draws this conclusions. Now, Gallagher is a Protestant. He doesn't have Catholic leanings. In fact, I think has very much Protestant leanings in his research. But he has this to write concerning our passage we're looking at today. He says, quote, "We might ask why this interpretation found expression and met with such popularity at this particular time at the end of the 18th century, whereas no one seems to have thought of it earlier," which is an excellent question. Why is it all of a sudden this argument just blows up and it spreads like wildfire in the late 1700s, early 1800s? Why this particular time? Gallagher continues, quote, "Surely the stability of the sequence of books in printed Hebrew Bibles made a contribution. As noted earlier, of many patristic lists of the Old Testament books, none transmits a sequence with Chronicles at the end." Actually, Gallagher is wrong there. Innocent the First has Chronicles at the end. But still, it's eccentric, and he's not trying to reproduce any rabbinic Bible. He's just given a Christian canon. In fact, no certain evidence before the 12th century locates Chronicles at the end of the canon, except for the list preserved in Baba Batra. So there's nothing that points to Chronicles being at the end until the 12th century, except for Baba Batra. Even the Masoretic manuscripts, which often conclude with Chronicles, do not maintain this sequence universally. However, when the first Hebrew Bibles came off the press in the 15th century, it featured Chronicles at the end. And this has been true for every major printed Hebrew Bible up until the present. So, in other words, once the printing press starts printing Hebrew Bibles, printers uniformly place Chronicles at the end, even though this was not the tradition earlier. It was a mixed tradition up till the 12th century. Before that, there is no evidence of Chronicles being last except for Baba Batra. He continues, at the time of Eichhorn, when he published his work on the Old Testament, the printing press had for 3 centuries established Chronicles as a definite conclusion of the Hebrew Bible. So when Eichhorn comes on the scene, there's 3 centuries old printing tradition, like all the books he could get a hold of in Hebrew, all of them conclude with Chronicles, and that's when Eichhorn puts 2 and 2 together and comes up with the Bookends argument. He says, aha, this must correspond to Zechariah, son of Berechiah, and this ultimately, excuse me, this ultimately, Jesus must be outlined in the canon. Actually, if you look at my longer series in this channel, just go and search, by the way, you'll see that I go into Eichhorn a little bit, and he's actually a bit more nuanced than this. He realizes Chronicles isn't quite uniformly held to be the last. So, so that I think knocks the legs out of the second premise. Now, before I end with my conclusion and we do the summary overview, guys, if you watch this video up until this point, do me a favor in the chat room, type in Apocrypha Apocalypse or AA, if you will, just to let us know that you made it through this video. And good for you, by the way, even though this is a short video. It's a lot of information. Also, while you're at it, why don't you just subscribe and like if you haven't done it already. Tell your friends about the channel. Let's grow the channel. Also, if you want to support our work, William Albrecht and myself are on Patreon. You can see the links in the comment section, or not the comment section, but the notes section for this video. Please, we appreciate your support. If it helps support our families while we do this research. So many, many, many thanks for those who have supported us and liked and subscribed and all that. Totally appreciate it. Okay, so what does this end up with? First premise, that Jesus speaks of all the prophets ending with Zechariah and Second Chronicles. What we've seen is that's a problematic identification. Zechariah and Chronicles doesn't seem to fit the bill. He's the son of Jehoiada, not Berechiah. Also, he's not a contemporary of Jesus, so you'd have to use whom you murdered in a historical sense, which isn't really the natural plane rating, I would argue. There are other candidates I think that are far less problematic. So I would say premise 1 is dubious, possibly wrong. Also, I want to mention that unmentioned assumption that because Jesus mentions a martyrdom in a particular book, that he means to say that book is the last book of the scriptures, when it does not necessarily follow. It could be the first martyrdom that calls for vengeance and the second or the last martyrdom that calls for vengeance. It doesn't have to be the first canonical martyrdom and the last canonical martyrdom. They would have to give some backing for that unspoken assumption, and really, you can't have any backing for it. It's just an unfounded assumption. Why? Because it makes the argument work, in my humble opinion. Second premise, Chronicles is the last book of the Hebrew Protestant Bible. Traditionally, that is not true as far as the Hebrew Bible is concerned. Only one manuscript, Baba Batra 14b, has Chronicles last. The oldest Hebrew codices have Ezra and Nehemiah last. Nearly all Christian lists, just one Christian list has Chronicles. All the other ones, including those that specifically are trying to reproduce the rabbinic scriptures, do not have Chronicles last. They have Daniel or Esther or even Ezra, Nehemiah. There is no certain evidence before the 12th century for Chronicles last except for Baba Bathra. So we have uniformity of data, early data pointing in the opposite direction. You only have one document that points towards Chronicles being the end. But we do have a perfect uniformed printing tradition that started in the 1500s that places Chronicles last. And I think Edmund Gallagher hit the nail on the head. I think this is exactly what spurred Eichhorn and all the others in the 1800s to jump on the bandwagon for the bookends argument. Because, well, you go to the seminary library, pull out your Tanakh, and lo and behold, every printed Tanakh ends with Chronicles. So it wouldn't even cross your mind that that's not the original order, when in fact it really is a tradition started really in the 15th century, although it certainly had some predecessors before then. But before the 1200s, it seems like the evidence is pretty much uniformly against it, except for Baba Bathra. So, and this is the best argument, I think, that can be made for the Protestant canon. And I think the second premise is wrong. There is no proof that Jesus' Bible concluded with Chronicles. Now, beware, folks, because what often happens is when this is pointed out, the bookends argument is sometimes used to establish the second premise. And this, of course, begs the question. What they'll argue is Zechariah, son of Berechiah, is actually Jehoiada in Second Chronicles. And then they'll say, we know Second Chronicles is the last book because Jesus names him as the last martyr. And then based on that fact, since Second Chronicles is the last book, Jesus's martyr happens to affirm the last book of the Hebrew Bible. So it's circular reasoning, right? Don't allow people to do that. Don't allow them to use the bookend argument to establish the second premise of the bookend argument. And then once that second premise is established, use it to finish the bookend argument. It's just pure and simple begging the question, circular reasoning. It's bad. It's bad argument. All right, guys, that is the end of our presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, if you haven't done it, please subscribe, like, put Apocrypha Apocalypse or AA in the comments. Let us know you got to the end. Also, again, Patreon, we appreciate your support, William Albrecht. And until next week, my name is Gary Machuda. Thank you so much and have a great week, everyone.